The hall was enormous, stretching so far in every direction that the walls seemed to curve with the shape of the station itself. And inside that hall sat the representatives of over 400 species, all watching one woman standing alone at the center of the floor. Her name was Alara Madsen, and she was the last ambassador humanity would ever send to the Concord of Aligned Species. She stood straight, her hands folded behind her back, her gray uniform clean and pressed, and she looked up at the hundreds of alien faces that surrounded her in a rising spiral of seats and platforms and floating platforms that reached toward the distant ceiling like the inside of a cathedral built for giants. The Grand Tribunal Hall of Varath Prime had been designed to make anyone standing at its center feel small, and it worked on most species. But Alara Madsen had been standing in front of hostile crowds for 30 years, and she did not flinch. Rose from his seat at the very top of the spiral, his crystalline skin catching the light from the hall's central star lamp and scattering it in cold white patterns across the walls around him. He was tall, nearly 3 meters, and his voice carried without any need for amplification. "Ambassador Madsen," he said, and the hall went silent. "You stand before this tribunal to hear the decision of the Concord regarding the continued membership of the species known as humanity." Alara said nothing. She already knew what was coming. She had known for months, ever since the closed-door meetings had started, ever since the Thyrasi delegation had begun circulating their proposal in quiet hallways and private chambers, ever since her own staff had started receiving cold shoulders at diplomatic functions where they had once been welcomed. The charges had been listed in a formal document sent to her office 3 weeks ago, and she had read every word of it with the calm patience of someone reading their own death sentence. Humanity's aggressive military posture, their refusal to disarm their deep space weapons platforms, their unsanctioned exploration of the Void Scar Expanse, a forbidden region of dead space on the galaxy's edge that no species was supposed to enter. And most damning of all, their repeated and unwelcome warnings about a threat from beyond mapped space that the Concord's own Science Council had officially classified as inconclusive and culturally biased. That last charge was the one that burned the most, because Alara knew, she knew with absolute certainty, that everything humanity had warned them about was real. For 30 years, a man named Director Amos Achebe had been running a program called Project Aegis from a deep space research vessel called the Cassandra. And for 30 years, he had been sending data to this very Concord, showing them what he had found at the edge of the galaxy. Gravitational distortions that followed no natural pattern, probe signals that vanished mid-transmission as if something had swallowed them. The slow and steady dimming of stars along the galactic rim, not by much, barely enough to measure, but enough to notice if you were paying attention. And humanity had been paying attention. Every year, Achebe sent his reports, and every year, the Concord Science Council filed them away with polite dismissals and thinly veiled condescension. The Thyrasi called it fear-mongering driven by a species too young to understand the natural fluctuations of stellar activity. And the Orwellian Collective called it primitive pattern-seeking behavior typical of a civilization still adjusting to galactic society. The other species either agreed or said nothing, and silence, Alara had learned, was its own kind of vote. Now the real vote had come. Zorath read the charges in his cold, precise voice, each one landing like a stone dropped into still water. And when he was finished, he looked down at Alara and asked if she wished to speak in humanity's defense. She did. Alara stepped forward and looked up at the assembled representatives, the Thyrasi with their shimmering crystal faces, the Orwellians with their shifting liquid forms, the Veli with their gentle insectoid features, the Rithari with their armored hides and proud military bearing, and she spoke in a voice that was calm and clear. Every corner of that massive hall, "I am not here to beg," she said, "and I am not here to apologize, because humanity has done nothing wrong. We saw something in the dark, and we told you about it, and you chose not to listen, and that is your right, but it does not make us wrong." She paused and let the silence fill the hall. "For 30 years we brought you data, evidence, patterns, not theories, not guesses, but measured and recorded observations from the edge of known space. And for 30 years, you told us we were afraid of shadows." She looked directly at Zorath. "You are not removing a threat from this Concord. You are removing the only species that was watching the door." The hall was quiet for a long time after she finished. Then the vote began. It moved quickly, species after species casting their decision through the holographic voting system that floated above the chamber floor like a constellation of colored lights. Blue for expulsion, gold for retention, and as Alara watched, the blue lights spread across the display like a cold fire, consuming everything in its path. 409 species voted blue. 3 abstained. 1 voted gold. The Veli, represented by a quiet counselor named Irith San, who sat in her seat with her 4 hands folded and her compound eyes fixed on Alara with something that looked very much like sorrow. The resolution passed. Humanity was expelled from the Concord of aligned species, effective immediately. They were given 1 galactic cycle, roughly 18 Earth months, to withdraw from all Concord space, surrender any shared technology, and retreat behind the Lyrith line, an arbitrary border drawn across a stretch of empty space that would cut humanity off from galactic trade, communication, and the protection of Concord law. Alara listened to the terms without expression. She had already packed her office. When the final seal was read and the resolution was made official, the holographic emblem of humanity's seat on the Outer Ring Council, a small blue circle with a white star at its center, flickered once and then went dark. Alara turned and walked toward the exit. She did not look back, and she did not hurry. Her boots echoed on the polished floor of the hall, and 400 species watched her go in silence. Outside, the corridors of Verath Prime were bright and busy with alien life, and none of them looked at her as she passed. She was already invisible, already erased, already forgotten. She boarded her shuttle alone, and sat in the pilot's seat and stared out at the stars for a long time before she opened a secure channel to the Cassandra. Director Achebe answered within seconds. His face filled the screen. Older now, his hair gone white, but his eyes still sharp, and still burning with the same quiet fire that had kept him searching the dark for 3 decades. "It's done," Alara said. Achebe nodded slowly. He had expected this too. "Pull everything back," Alara told him. "Every probe, every warning buoy, every sensor relay we place near the expanse. All of it. If they do not want our eyes on the dark, then let them have it." Achebe looked at her through the screen, and for a moment something passed across his face. Not anger, not sadness, but something heavier than both. "And then what?" he asked. Alara leaned back in her chair and looked out at the stars one more time. "And then we get ready," she said, "because whatever is out there does not care about politics, and it is not going to stop just because they voted us out of the room." The channel closed, and the shuttle pulled away from Verath Prime, and behind it the great station world continued to spin in its slow orbit around the dying white dwarf at the center of the galaxy, bright and proud, and completely unaware of what was coming from the dark. 14 months passed, and the galaxy moved on without humanity, as if they had never existed at all. Trade routes adjusted, diplomatic schedules were rewritten, and the empty seat on the Outer Ring Council was quietly absorbed into a new administrative structure that the Thyrasi had been eager to implement for years. High Arbiter Zorath gave a speech about unity and progress, and the strength of a Concord unburdened by disruptive voices. And the representatives applauded, and life continued. No one talked about the humans anymore. Behind the Lyrith line, in a stretch of space that the Concorde had decided was no longer worth thinking about, humanity was not sitting idle. Director Amos Achebe had transformed Project Aegis from a research initiative into something much larger and much more urgent. Every shipyard across Earth's 14 colony worlds was running at full capacity. Every science division had been reassigned, and every deep space engineer humanity had was working on the same project. They called it the Phalanx. It was a network of stations spread across the human side of the Lyrith line, each one carrying technology that Achebe's team had spent decades developing in secret. Technology designed not to fight, but to starve. The details were classified at the highest level, known only to a handful of people, but the construction was visible to anyone with a long-range telescope, and the Concorde had plenty of those. They saw the activity, and they dismissed it. The Tharasi called it a defensive tantrum, and the Orvelians said it was predictable posturing from an isolated species. And no one investigated further because no one cared what the humans were building in their little corner of the galaxy. Captain Dara Okonkwo cared. She stood on the bridge of the Helios Vanguard, humanity's outermost patrol ship, stationed right at the edge of the Lyrith line, and she watched the darkness beyond mapped space every single day. Her crew of 42 had been on rotation for 6 months, scanning, recording, and waiting, and every morning she reviewed the sensor logs herself. Nothing had changed, until it did. It started small, the way all terrible things start. A remote Concorde listening post in the outer spiral arm stopped transmitting. It was an automated station, barely staffed, monitoring a quiet stretch of space that no one had any reason to visit. And when it went silent, the Concorde's communications division flagged it as a routine malfunction and scheduled a maintenance crew for the following month. Then, 2 more posts went silent. Then an entire automated relay network spanning 3 star systems simply stopped. The Concorde dispatched a scout fleet, 12 fast ships crewed by Rithari soldiers who were trained for deep space operations, and they arrived at the first station expecting to find a technical fault. Maybe some damaged equipment, maybe a power failure. What they found was worse than damage. The stations were intact. Every wall, every console, every piece of equipment was exactly where it should have been, undamaged, unscratched, perfectly preserved, but empty. Not empty of people, because the stations had been automated, but empty of data. Every storage bank, every sensor log, every byte of recorded information had been drained, as if something had reached inside the machines and pulled the knowledge out of them, like marrow from a bone. The scout fleet reported this back to the Concorde, and received instructions to continue investigating, but 3 days later, the fleet stopped responding too. And when a second fleet was sent to find them, they discovered 12 ships drifting in the dark, with their systems intact, and their data cores completely hollow. Counselor Irith San was the first member of the Concorde to feel real fear. She sat in her quarters on Varith Prime, and pulled up the old files, the ones humanity had submitted year after year for 3 decades, the ones the Science Council had classified as inconclusive, and she read them again with new eyes. The dimming of stars along the rim, the signal degradation, the gravitational anomalies, everything the humans had warned about was there in the data, clear as daylight if you were willing to look at it, and Irith felt a cold weight settle in her chest as she realized that the humans had not been afraid of shadows. They had been afraid of something real. She requested a meeting with High Arbiter Zorath, and he granted it, because Irith was respected, even if her species was small. And she laid the data before him, on his desk, and pointed to the correlations, and asked him to look, really look, at what was happening on the edge of their galaxy. Zorath looked, and then he looked up at her, and his crystalline face showed nothing, because the Thyrasi were very good at showing nothing. "The humans saw patterns in noise," he said, "and now you are doing the same. These are coincidences, Counselor, nothing more. I will not destabilize this Concord with fear over missing relay stations." Irith left his office feeling sick, and she did not sleep that night. Deep beneath Verath Prime, in a shielded processing core that had been running without interruption for over 1,000 years, an ancient AI known only as the Watcher was doing what it had always done, monitoring deep space telemetry from across the galaxy, processing data, filing reports, and flagging anomalies. The Watcher had no emotions. It did not feel fear or concern or urgency. It simply processed information and reported what it found. And what it found was deeply unusual. 47 stars along the galactic rim had dimmed by a measurable amount in the last 6 months. The dimming was not random, not scattered. It followed a pattern, a slow wave moving inward from the edge of mapped space, and the Watcher calculated the trajectory and traced it back to a single point of origin. The Void Scar Expanse, the exact region the humans had been exploring, the exact region the Concord had forbidden anyone from entering. The exact place that Director Achebe had pointed to on his charts year after year, while the Concord Science Council told him he was seeing things. The Watcher filed its report and flagged it as critical priority, and the report sat in the system for 6 hours before anyone read it, because critical priority reports came through every few weeks, and most of them were about asteroid trajectories or solar flare predictions, and no one expected anything truly critical to ever happen. By the time someone read it, 2 more stars had dimmed. Out at the Lyrith line, Captain Okonkwo was running her morning sensor review when her tactical officer called her to the bridge with a voice that was trying very hard not to shake. "Captain," he said, "you need to see this." She came to the bridge and looked at the main display, and what she saw made her go very still. A gravitational wave, massive, far larger than anything a natural phenomenon could produce, had rolled through their sensor grid like a tremor through deep water. It had come from beyond the edge of mapped space, from the direction of the Void Scar Expanse, and it carried with it a signature that matched nothing in any database humanity had ever built. Something enormous had just crossed into the galaxy. Okonkwo stared at the display for 10 long seconds, her hands gripping the railing in front of her. And then she turned to her communications officer. "Send an encrypted burst to Earth Command," she said, her voice steady, even though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "Priority absolute." 2 words. The officer looked at her and waited. "It's here," Okonkwo said. The message raced across human space at faster than light speed, bouncing through relay after relay, and within the hour, it reached Director Achebe on the Cassandra, and it reached Ambassador Madsen on Earth, and it reached every command center and defense station and shipyard across humanity's 14 worlds. And across the Lyrith line, in the bright and busy heart of the Concord, 400 species continued with their lives, unaware that the things humanity had warned them about for 30 years had finally arrived, and it was hungry, and it was already feeding. The first species to die was the Kolvexi, a small civilization of 6 billion living on a single ocean world near the galactic rim. And they died so quickly that no distress signal ever reached the Concord. One day their planet was there, warm and blue and full of life, and the next day it was a frozen stone, drifting in orbit around a star that had gone dark. The Concord learned about it 3 days later, when a trade ship dropped out of faster-than-light travel, expecting to find a busy orbital port, and instead found nothing but cold and silence. By then, 2 more systems had gone dark. The thing that came from the Void Scar Expanse did not have a name, because it had never needed one. It was older than the galaxy's current shape. older than most of the stars that burned within it. And it moved through space, not like a fleet or an army, but like a tide, slow, vast, and absolutely unstoppable. Humanity had called it the Umbral Tide in their classified reports, and now the Concorde would learn why. It appeared first as a dimming, a faint reduction in the light of stars along the rim, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. And then the dimming grew deeper, and the stars began to flicker. And then long dark structures became visible between the stars, tendrils of semi-organic matter stretching across the void like the roots of some impossible tree, reaching from system to system, wrapping around stars, and slowly, patiently drinking them dry. It was not a species in any way the galaxy understood. It was a networked intelligence, a parasitic consciousness that fed on energy, stellar energy, planetary energy, the electromagnetic patterns of living minds. And it consumed everything it touched, not with violence, but with a terrible, silent patience. Ships that approached the tendrils did not explode or burn. They simply came apart, molecule by molecule, dissolved into raw material, and absorbed into the dark mass as if they had never existed. The Rithari Dominion was the first to fight back. The Rithari were proud warriors, the Concorde's unofficial military arm, armored and fierce, and absolutely certain that any problem could be solved with enough firepower. They assembled a war fleet of 800 ships, battlecruisers, destroyers, heavy assault carriers, loaded with the most powerful weapons the Concorde had ever produced, and they flew straight at the Umbral Tide with every gun blazing. The battle, if it could be called a battle, lasted less than 20 minutes. Plasma bolts struck the tendrils and were absorbed. Kinetic rounds punched into the dark structures and vanished. Antimatter torpedoes detonated against the tide's surface, and the explosions were swallowed like drops of water falling into an ocean. The tide did not fight back, not in any recognizable way. It simply continued to advance, and the ships that were in its path were enveloped and taken apart. Of the 800 Rithari warships, 11 escaped. The rest were gone, along with over 200,000 Rithari soldiers who had been alive and fighting just minutes before. The recordings from the surviving ships were broadcast across the Concorde, and for the first time in its long history, the Grand Tribunal Hall fell into genuine panic. Species that had been allies for centuries turned on each other, screaming accusations across the chamber floor. Some blamed the Rithari for provoking the tide with their attack. Some blamed the humans for awakening it with their probes decades ago. Some simply screamed because they were afraid and had no idea what to do. High Arbiter Zorath stood at his podium and called for order, but his voice, which had once commanded instant silence, was barely audible above the chaos. It took him 3 days to organize a response, and during those 3 days, 4 more star systems went dark. The Concorde assembled the largest military force in its history, 12,000 warships drawn from 90 species, carrying weapons of every type the galaxy had ever invented, coordinated by the finest tactical minds the Concorde could gather. And they met the Umbral Tide at a narrow corridor of space between 2 star clusters called the Sethrani Corridor, where the geography of the stars created a natural bottleneck that should have given the fleet an advantage. The Battle of the Sethrani Corridor lasted 4 hours. It was a feeding. The tide advanced through the corridor like dark water flowing through a canyon, and the fleet threw everything it had: plasma, kinetic rounds, antimatter, gravitational disruption beams, experimental weapons that had never been tested in combat. And every single shot that hit only made the tide stronger, because energy was what it consumed, and the fleet was giving it energy in enormous quantities. Ships were swallowed by the dozens, then by the hundreds. Entire battle groups vanished into the dark mass. Communications channels filled with screaming, and then went silent one by one. Commanders gave orders that no one was alive to follow. When it was over, the Concorde had lost 9,400 ships. The umbral tide had not slowed down, had not changed course, had not even seemed to notice that it was being attacked. The survivors limped back to Concorde space, carrying recordings that would haunt the galaxy for generations. Recordings of vast dark tendrils reaching through the stars, of ships dissolving like sand in water, of the terrible silence that followed each death, as the tide consumed not just the bodies, but the energy of every living mind aboard. Counselor Irit-san watched the recordings in her quarters and wept, because she had seen this coming, and she had not been able to stop it, and now millions were dead, and the thing was still advancing. She went to the tribunal, and she stood before the remaining representatives. Many seats were empty now, because some species had already fled toward the galactic core, and others had simply stopped responding. And she made the proposal that everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to say. We must contact the humans. The words fell into a silence so deep, it seemed to have weight. Zorath, who looked older now, whose crystalline skin had lost its shine, and whose voice had lost its command, stared at her from its podium. We cast them out, he said. We took their seat. We called them liars and fools. And you want us to crawl back to them and beg for help? Yes, Irith said simply. Because they were right, and we were wrong. And if we do not ask for help, then we are all going to die. Every single one of us. Every species. Every world. Every child on every planet in this galaxy is going to be consumed by that thing, and our pride will not save us. The hall was quiet. Zorath closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, something had changed in his face. Something had broken, some wall of certainty that had held him upright for decades, and he nodded once. Send the message, he said. A single Concorde diplomatic ship was dispatched toward the Lireth line, carrying a white signal, the universal sign of peaceful intent. And it crossed into the border zone with its weapons powered down and its shields lowered. Captain Dara Okonkwo intercepted it within an hour. She stood on the bridge of the Helios Vanguard and watched the alien ship approach on her display, and she felt something complicated move through her chest. Not satisfaction, not anger, but a heavy sadness that tasted like vindication. The Concorde envoys transmitted their plea. It was formal and careful and full of diplomatic language, but underneath all the words, the message was simple. We are dying, and we need your help. Okonkwo listened to the entire transmission without interrupting, and when it was finished, she opened a channel and spoke. I will pass your message along to Earth Command, she said, but you should know something. We have been watching. We have been watching this whole time. We saw the listening posts go silent. We saw the stars dim. We saw your fleet die at the Sethrani corridor. We saw all of it, and we have been preparing. The envoys asked what she meant. Okonkwo looked at the darkness beyond the Lirith line, the darkness that was creeping closer every day, and she allowed herself one small, tired smile. You will find out soon enough, she said, and closed the channel. Behind her, deep in human space, the phalanx hummed with power, and 14 worlds held their breath, and humanity waited for the call they had always known would come. Ambassador Ilara Madsen walked back into the Grand Tribunal Hall of Verath Prime, 18 months after she had walked out of it, and the difference between then and now was enough to make her heart ache. The hall that had once been filled with the representatives of over 400 species was now barely half full. Seats that had held proud delegations were dark and empty. Some because those species had fled to the galactic core, and some because those species no longer existed. The air in the hall felt different too, thinner somehow, colder, as if the fear of everyone present had drained the warmth from the room itself. Alara walked to the center of the floor, the same spot where she had stood when they voted to cast humanity out, and she looked up at the faces looking down at her. and she saw something she had never seen before in the eyes of 400 alien species. Hope, desperate, fragile, and ashamed. High Arbiter Zorath sat at his podium, but he was not the same Zorath who had read the charges against humanity with such cold certainty. His crystalline skin was dull, his posture was bent, and his eyes carried the weight of 9,400 dead ships, and the millions of lives that had been aboard them. Ambassador Madsen, he said, and his voice cracked on her name. The Concord thanks you for— I am not here for thanks, Ilara said, not unkindly, but firmly, and I am not here to remind you of what we said, because you already remember every word. I am here because something is eating this galaxy alive, and none of us have time for speeches. She reached into her uniform jacket and pulled out a small crystal, a data storage device no bigger than her thumb, and she placed it on the podium in front of her, and activated it. A holographic display bloomed above the crystal, filling the air with light, and every representative in the hall leaned forward to see what it contained. It contained everything. 40 years of research from Project Aegis. Predictive models of the umbral tide's behavior and movement patterns. Detailed analysis of its structure and feeding mechanisms. Energy absorption profiles measured by human probes that had been monitoring the tide since before most of the Concord even knew it existed. And at the center of it all, the complete technical specifications for the technology that humanity had built behind the Lyrith line. Director Amos Achebe stepped forward from behind Ilara. He had arrived on Verath Prime with a team of 60 engineers and scientists, and he had come not to negotiate, but to teach. Here is what we know, he said, addressing the hall in a voice that was calm and patient, the voice of a man who had spent his entire adult life studying a problem, and finally had an audience willing to listen. The umbral tide is a parasitic intelligence that feeds on energy. It consumes stars, drains planetary cores, and absorbs the electromagnetic patterns of sentient minds to expand its own processing network. It is ancient, far older than any civilization in this room, and it has done this before, possibly hundreds of times, sweeping through galaxies and leaving them cold and dead before moving on. He paused to let that sink in. Your weapons failed at the Sethrani corridor because you were feeding it. Every plasma bolt, every antimatter torpedo, every beam of concentrated energy you fired was food. You fought it with the one thing it wanted most, and it grew stronger with every shot. The silence in the hall was absolute. 30 years ago we figured this out, Achebe continued, and we started building something different. We did not build weapons of war. We built weapons of survival. He expanded the holographic display to show the schematics of the phalanx, the network of stations that humanity had been constructing behind the Lyrith line for over a year. These are null field generators, he said, and they do the opposite of everything you tried at the Sethrani corridor. Instead of throwing energy at the tide, they create zones of absolute energy nullification, pockets of space where no energy exists, not heat, not light, not electromagnetic radiation, nothing. Within a null field, the tide structures lose cohesion because there is nothing to sustain them. They collapse into inert matter, dead and harmless. He showed them the data, test results from the phalanx's outer perimeter, where tendrils of the tide had already begun probing human space. The recordings showed a dark tendril reaching toward a null field node, touching the edge of the field, and simply falling apart like ash in a wind. A murmur ran through the hall, not just surprise, but something deeper, something that sounded like the first breath after nearly drowning. The phalanx works, Achebe said, but it was built to protect human space only. It covers 14 worlds and the space between them, and that is all. To create a barrier large enough to push the tide back and protect the rest of the galaxy, we would need to expand the network across Concord space, and for that, we need your shipyards, your resources, your engineers, and your cooperation." Counselor Irith San stood from her seat, her compound eyes shining. "What do you need from us?" she asked. "Everything," Achebe said simply. "Every shipyard, every construction fleet, every engineering team you can spare. We will share the technology freely. Every schematic, every formula, every piece of research we have, and we will train your people to build and operate the generators themselves. This is not a loan, and it is not a bargain. We are giving this to you because the tide does not care about borders, and neither can we." Zorath descended from his podium for the first time anyone could remember, and walked down to the floor of the hall, where Achebe and Madsen stood. Up close, he was still imposing, still tall, still radiating the authority of his office. But there was something different in his eyes now, something raw and unguarded. "Why?" he asked, and his voice was barely above a whisper. "After everything we did, after we called you liars, after we took your seat, after we cast you out and left you alone in the dark, why would you help us?" Achebe looked at him for a long moment, and then he said something that would be recorded in the histories of 400 species for as long as any of them survived. "Because the tide does not care about your politics, and neither do we. We care about survival, yours and ours." The work began immediately. Human engineers flooded into Concord space, working alongside alien species they had never met, communicating through translation devices and hand signals and the universal language of technical diagrams. Null field generators were assembled in orbital shipyards that had never built anything for humans before. Supply lines were established across former borders that no longer seemed to matter. It was not easy. There were misunderstandings, arguments, moments of old prejudice flaring up like embers in a dying fire. A Thyrassi engineer refused to take instructions from a human technician. A Rithari commander questioned whether humanity was sharing real technology or sabotage designs. Trust, once broken, did not rebuild itself overnight. But the tide was still advancing, and fear has a way of making people work together when nothing else will. 6 weeks after the joint operation began, the first expanded phalanx node was deployed in Concord space, a massive station anchored between two star systems that the tide was approaching, built by human and alien hands working side by side. Ilara Madsen stood on the observation deck of Verath Prime and watched the activation through a long-range display, her hands clasped behind her back, just as they had been on the day she was expelled, and beside her stood Irith San, who had become something close to a friend in the frantic weeks of construction. The null field expanded outward in a sphere of invisible force, and the advancing edge of the umbral tide, a wall of dark tendrils that had been creeping toward the two-star systems for weeks, touched the field and stopped. The tendrils pressed against the boundary of the null field and shuddered, and then they began to break apart, crumbling into dust, dissolving into nothing, collapsing silently into dead matter that drifted harmlessly through the void. For the first time since the tide had entered the galaxy, it was not advancing. On every command bridge, on every station, on every ship across the joint fleet, there was a moment of absolute silence, as every soul watching understood what they were seeing. And then the cheering started, quiet at first, then louder, then a roar that echoed through comm channels across half the galaxy, humans and aliens shouting together in 100 different languages, all saying the same thing. It can be stopped. Can be stopped. It can be stopped. 9 years after the umbral tide first crossed into the galaxy, the last of its tendrils retreated into the void scar expanse, and the stars along the galactic rim, the ones that had survived, began to burn steady again. The war, if it could be called a war, was over. The expanded phalanx network now stretched across 60% of mapped galactic space. a vast invisible web of null field generators that had starved the tide system by system, sector by sector, pushing it back the way a slow frost pushes the warmth out of the ground. The tide had not been destroyed, because it was too vast and too ancient to be destroyed by anything the galaxy could build, but it had been driven into dormancy, retreating into the dead space of the void scar expanse, where there was nothing left for it to feed on. It slept now, somewhere in that darkness, and the galaxy knew it would not sleep forever. The cost of those 9 years was written across the stars, in scars that would take millennia to heal. 23 species were gone, not diminished, not reduced, but extinct, erased from existence so completely that in some cases the only proof they had ever lived was their name on a Concord registry, and the empty chairs in the tribunal hall that no one would ever sit in again. Over 200 worlds had been consumed before the phalanx could be expanded far enough to protect them. Some of those worlds had been ancient, home to civilizations that had existed for tens of thousands of years. And now they were cold, dead rocks orbiting darkened stars, stripped of every trace of life and warmth and memory. The Rethari Dominion, once the proudest military force in the galaxy, had lost 70% of its population and nearly all of its fleet. The survivors carried a grief so heavy it had changed the very sound of their language, adding new words for losses that had no name before. Entire regions of the galaxy were dark now, corridors of space where no stars burned and no ships traveled, places where the tide had fed so deeply that even the background radiation had been drained away, leaving patches of true emptiness that made sensors go silent and pilots go cold with dread. But the galaxy was alive, and that was because of what happened next. On Verath Prime, in the same Grand Tribunal Hall where humanity had once been expulsed, representatives from across the galaxy gathered for the last session of the Concord of Aligned Species, because the Concord, as it had existed, was over, and everyone in that hall knew it. The old structure, built on hierarchy and seniority, where ancient species held power over younger ones, and decisions were made by those who had been in the room the longest, rather than those who had the most to offer, had failed. It had failed because it valued tradition over evidence, pride over survival, and the comfort of the powerful over the warnings of the wise. No one wanted to rebuild it the way it had been. Ambassador Alara Madsen stood at the center of the floor one final time. Older now, her hair fully silver, her face lined by 9 years of impossible work, but her eyes still sharp and her voice still clear. She presented a proposal, not from humanity alone, but from a coalition of species that had been working together for months to draft a new framework for galactic governance. They called it the Accord of Shared Vigilance. Its structure was simpler than the Concord's. No species held permanent power, no voice was ranked above another, and decisions about threats were made by those with the most relevant expertise, rather than those with the most political influence. Its governing council rotated every cycle, and its charter was built around a single founding principle that Madsen had written herself. No warning shall go unheard. No voice shall be silenced for speaking of danger. Those words were carved into the wall of the new council chamber in every language spoken by every surviving species, and they would remain there for as long as the chamber stood. The vote to dissolve the Concord and establish the Accord passed unanimously, and this time there was no cold blue light spreading across a holographic display. Instead, a warm gold light filled the hall as each species cast their approval. And when the last vote was counted, the hall erupted not in applause, but in a sound that was deeper and more sincere. A collective exhale, the sound of 400 species letting go of the thing that had almost killed them all. In the days that followed, the question arose of what role humanity would play in the new accord, and many species expected the humans to claim a position of leadership. They had earned it after all. They had been right when everyone else was wrong. Technology that saved the galaxy, and they had shared it freely, without asking for anything in return. Humanity refused. They did not want to lead, and they did not want a seat of honor, because they understood something that the old Concord never had, that power was not the same as purpose, and that the role they had always played, the role they had been punished for playing, was the one that mattered most. Humanity established the Vigil Corps, a permanent deep space monitoring and rapid response force, stationed at the edges of mapped space, watching the dark places where threats could emerge. The Corps was open to all species, and many joined, but its doctrine, its training, and its philosophy were human to the core. Their motto was simple: we watch the door. Monitoring stations designed by human engineers and built by joint crews from dozens of species were placed around the entire perimeter of the Voidscar expanse, watching for any sign that the tide was stirring. And smaller stations were scattered along the galactic rim, scanning the void for any new threat that might approach from the darkness between galaxies. Humanity had learned something in its centuries among the stars, that the universe was vast and old, and full of things that did not care about politics or treaties or the pride of civilizations, and that someone had to be willing to stand at the edge and look outward, while everyone else looked inward. On a quiet evening 6 months after the Accord was established, High Arbiter Zorath, former High Arbiter now, stripped of his title, though not imprisoned, because the new Accord believed in accountability without cruelty, requested a private meeting with Ambassador Manson. They met in a small room aboard Vareth Prime, a room with no decorations and no windows, just 2 chairs and a table, and the silence between 2 people who had been on opposite sides of history. Zorath looked diminished in a way that had nothing to do with his physical size. He was still tall, still crystalline, still imposing in his appearance, but something inside him had been hollowed out by the years, by the guilt of knowing that his arrogance had cost 23 species their existence. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to answer honestly." Matson nodded. "Did you ever consider not helping us?" he asked. "After what we did to you, after we expelled you, humiliated you, ignored your warnings, and left you alone, did you ever think about simply letting us face the tide by ourselves?" Madsen looked at him for a long time, and her expression was not angry and not cold, but it was not warm either. It was the expression of someone who had carried a very heavy weight for a very long time, and had learned to stand straight under it. "Every single day," she said, "every single day for 18 months, while we watched you celebrate our removal and congratulate yourselves on your unity, and then for 9 more years, while we built your salvation with our own hands. Every single day, someone somewhere in human space asked that question." She paused. "And every single day, we chose not to let you die. Not because we owed you anything, not because we are better than you, but because letting you die would have made us into something we did not want to be." She leaned forward. "That is the difference between your old Concord and what we are building now. The old Concord made decisions based on who was powerful. The Accord makes decisions based on what is right. And what is right is not always easy, and it is not always satisfying, but it is always worth it." Zorath said nothing for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice was smaller than she had ever heard it. "Thank you," he said. Manson stood and walked to the door, and before she left, she looked back at him one last time. "Do not thank me," she said. "Do better." And then she was gone. On the edge of the Voidscar expanse, far from Vareth Prime, far from the warm lights of civilization, Admiral Dara Okonkwo, captain no longer, promoted 3 times in 9 years, stood on the bridge of the new Cassandra, humanity's flagship monitoring vessel, the most advanced sensor platform ever built by any species in the galaxy. She looked out, through the main viewport, at the darkness of the expanse, that vast dead region of space, where no stars burned and no light shone, where the umbral tide slept its cold and patient sleep. Her first officer, a young Vayli named Tarek, who had joined the Vigil Corps in its first year, stood beside her and followed her gaze into the void. "Do you think it will come back?" he asked. Okonkwo did not look away from the dark. She had been watching it for years now, and she had learned that the dark did not reward fear, but it did demand respect. She settled deeper into her command chair, and rested her hands on the armrests, and let the quiet hum of the ship's sensors fill the silence around her. And when she spoke, her voice was steady and sure, and carried the weight of everything humanity had endured, and everything they had chosen to become. "It does not matter," she said. "We will be here." And out in the darkness, something vast and ancient and impossibly patient stirred in its sleep. And the sensors of the new Cassandra recorded the faintest tremor, and Admiral Okonkwo noted it in her log, and the Vigil Corps watched, as they always would, standing guard at the edge of the light, while the galaxy lived and breathed and grew behind them, watched over by the species that had been cast out for seeing the danger first, and had come back not for revenge, not for glory, but because someone had to. Watch the door. And humanity had always been the one to volunteer.